Welcome to Digital Customer Communications Regulated, where we explore how regulated organizations engage, retain, and protect customers at scale. This week, we're joined by Sam Bridges-Sparks, Head of BI Analytics and Strategy at Shawbrook Bank. He shares what it takes to build AI responsibly in a highly regulated setting, how to get teams comfortable using it, and where the biggest wins sit today. Hi, Sam.
Hi.
Can you give us a bit of an intro to your role at Shawbrook and what you're doing in terms of AI?
Yeah, sure. So, like you say, the official title is Head of BI and Strategy, but I sit within our kind of front office space. So I'm not in tech or operations, very much aimed around using data for, actual outcomes rather than just insights. Historically, that's been traditional data and MI reporting. With a little bit of a flavor of machine learning. But, in more recent years, it's been the explosion of AI. And really, when we talk about AI in that space, we're talking large language models, Gen AI. So take you a little bit through of how we've adopted that, what we've learned, both technically and culturally, I think are probably the interesting part.
Yeah, I actually found you because we had Mark Watson from Comply Advantage on, and I was prepping for that. And I watched a YouTube video with him in, I think, at a fintech conference or something, and you were on the panel, both talking about AI. I think there you talked about getting AI productionized and that being sort of one of the focuses at Shawbrook. What helped you move past POC and experimenting and research into AI to actually moving on to trying to productionize something and get it live and delivering value?
Yeah, good question. Because, I think we were quite naive with this, that getting it from POC to production would not be easy, but not be as difficult as it proved to be. And I think you're seeing this across the market, is that you could knock up something relatively quick now as a proof of concept, right? You don't need to be a coder. You don't really need to know how it works. You can go build a website in 5-10 minutes. But to turn that into a kind of productionized, reusable, governed, scaled piece of technology was really quite difficult. I think fortunately, probably for us at Shawbrook, when I've spoken to other people at, like you say, the conferences that Mark was on, is that we have this kind of fantastic culture of still kind of, even we're a big bank now, an entrepreneurial mindset of people outside of their current roles, jumping in and getting stuff done. So, what we started off with, myself and data scientists in my team, we very quickly kind of outgrew what we needed to do to get it into production. I'll give you the example of what we're doing. We're doing a very simple kind of competitor analysis. It was all on public data. What's our product A versus our competitors? Okay, so the actual AI piece of doing that, let's go scan the web, look at our website, look at our competitors, quick comparison. And like we all know, you can just speak to it in natural language. So do that very quickly. But then as we moved forward, to get that kind of internally into our normal IT operations is very hard. And I think the crux of it is that we found that it didn't fit any really normal ways of working. Yeah. So, as you'd expect at a financial service company, particularly a bank, we've got clear controlled pathways to go from development or a proof of concept to production. But we're using a large language model. It didn't really fit naturally into any of those gates. And what I mean by that are things like testing and accuracy. Yeah. So how could I reassure people that when I asked the question again, I got the same result? And I couldn't, right? Because I think, like we all know nowadays, that most of these things are doing a prediction. And if you put the same thing in twice, you won't get exactly the same response out. And a lot of kind of traditional testing is that you put in X and you compare it to X, and if they match, it's a green tick. We couldn't do that. So, little things, ironically, is we used a little bit more AI to kind of evaluate the answer to see if it was still within an acceptable remit of what we were expecting.
Right.
But again, that was a journey we had to take through with our IT colleagues and our governance colleagues. That is this an acceptable form of doing it? Same with our kind of model governance. I think as humans, but particularly in our risk and governance, we like accountability. If it spits out the wrong answer, not necessarily who's at fault, but can we identify why that is? Again, these things are a black box. We don't necessarily know. Even the foundational model companies themselves don't really know how it gets to the output it's deriving. So similarly, again, we kind of had to review how we were evaluating these models internally and how we got comfortable with doing that. And little things we do, which is bit of a market trend, making sure that we still have that human evaluation at the end, right? We weren't just putting AI in a workflow, removing the human and letting it go. So we very much still see it as, we use phrases like getting you 8 rungs up the ladder. So, it's saving 80% of the time. Your role now is really much of an evaluator rather than a doer. But technically as well, like I say, we needed a combination of skills across everything: infrastructure, like I say, data science, testing, governance, service design, because you don't necessarily want to replicate how you're already doing it, because that was aimed at a different form of technology, maybe just digital rules base or how humans work, but you don't necessarily need to do that anymore. So a lot of the initial challenge of getting it through was getting the right skill set focused onto the problem and then collaborating that in a kind of completely new way of working. We didn't have the luxury of going to Google and saying, how do you do this? Because no one had really done it, right? And this was a couple of years ago, but even today, there isn't a huge amount of expertise available out there because it's rapidly evolving. There aren't really necessarily patterns as such of how to do things. If they are, they're soon superseded by new ways of doing things. So I think the advice I would give is get into that culture and accepting that you're going to probably have to evolve your current way of working if you want to use some of this technology going forward, and getting comfortably internally what you do want to use it for and what you don't want to use it for.
And those kind of peripheral things, the governance, having the right skills, operational processes around AI, that's obviously been, as you say, a kind of last couple of years kind of process.
Yeah.
How has that changed how you're now? Obviously, that's a big bit of resource and a big bit of work and a lot of change management. But how has doing that kind of prepped you to be able to now take on AI projects and do things with AI that can be productionized quicker, faster, more effectively?
Yeah, I think the key thing is that now we have those foundational places, kind of models, controls in place. There's less of that unknown as we're getting into things. So, in hindsight, we probably should have included those colleagues earlier on. I think personally, I was quite naive and, ironically, it's probably due to data and AI in my life and social media feeds that I was just being surrounded by people who were like-minded by me, right? So I just anticipated everyone was going to be super excited with this stuff and they could see the opportunity there. But really, that isn't the reality. It's quite a media-led piece of technology at the moment. We've got fears of what it can and what it can't do if it spirals out of control. So like I say, if you can get those kind of guardrails, as we call them, in place, not just for building stuff internally, but we also spend a lot of time now on making use of third-party things. So we have an enterprise ChatGPT license, for example, but making it very clear guardrails of what you can use that for and what you can't use that for. At a high level, that's really around sensitivity of data. And then that kind of gives us a bit more reassurance that we're funneling our colleagues into the right tooling rather than, we were very aware before we had an enterprise license that we probably had a huge shadow AI culture of people using the public tools. I think setting those guardrails as clear as you can, as simply as you can early on, and knowing that they're just going to need evolving over time. So it's something we recurrently look at as we grow out our AI base, really.
And having those, starting with an internal kind of project like a competitor analysis it's probably a nice place to start because it's not hitting customers immediately.
Correct.
You've got that, but you've also got the risk, I guess, of, like you say, these things evolve so quickly that if you were to just set up an internal process or an internal workflow and automate it with AI, stick an LLM in there, in 9 months or so, the market has outpaced you. You're going to need to rebuild that. And because you've been focused on that so much, and that's what everybody's been using internally, they've not got that kind of that touch point with third party like enterprise GPT and stuff. For us, I think more than anything, that gives you a little bit of a pulse of where other things are compared to your internal processes. GPT has its uses, has its drawbacks, but it's a very good way using all of these tools, these third-party tools in the right way of seeing that could now be done for us internally, or perhaps then with our customers. Is that where you've kind of seen the strongest operational wins, those internal processes so far? And are you looking at more customer-facing stuff?
We are, and maybe it'll help kind of depict our kind of strategy of how we choose that AI tooling, because I think you touched on a good point there, Sam. And I always remember when we were doing the first internal piece, that actually became a chatbot in the end. I remember choosing the model at the time, and we were on the Microsoft stack, and it had an expiration date of like 6 months in the future. And I was like, oh no, that's going to be another thing that I've got to try and sell, right? Like, we're investing, but in 6 months' time, we're going to have to figure out what we're going to do with the model underneath. All this stuff we're not really used to. There's banking systems out there that haven't been touched for 25 years, and I'm trying to sell this thing as something we want to get going, but it's got a shelf life of possibly 6 months.
So how do you test it in a way that doesn't last 6 months and then you have to be testing again?
Exactly. And in hindsight, we, upgraded it way before that 6-month period came along anyway, because the market had moved on so much. But how we kind of think about it now is our starting point is the enterprise tooling a lot of the time. You go into our ChatGPT. You then have the opportunity to obviously build a GPT, if you like, for your certain use case as we roll that out across the bank as a whole. And then we're finding that you're going to hit a certain threshold at a certain point, right? And that could be that you now want to, let's say, join a workflow of many GPTs together. That's what we're finding is the most thing people happen, right? I do a little bit in this specific GPT, I do a little bit in it, but if I could pull it all together, you could do this whole, piece of process, which is the big value add. And that's where we now offlay that and funnel that into our kind of central internal builds, because we still have a relatively small internal team building stuff. But that's kind of our funnel of how we're trying to keep our hounds around AI usage, because there's such demand. So here you go, you've got GPT, go and have a play around with the guardrails we've already set. And, once you hit that certain level, if you do get there, not everyone gets there, you have this opportunity to offlay it into an internal team that will take that forward. And that's how we're kind of building out a kind of library of internal AI products, which are much more value add, encompassed by, a library of GPTs around the outside. And then we're still looking for partners, but at very specific niche use cases that, we either think are high effort, or we
sort of enterprise grade workflows.
Exactly. Yeah. So, might be in the underwriting space, but a particular part of that underwriting space, we might look for a partner rather than trying to build that out, because we think they could accelerate it faster than us.
So in terms of governance then and compliance, where are they getting involved in that process? Are the GPTs, the custom GPTs, sort of out there, they've got the guardrails and you can create them as long as you stay within those guardrails for whatever process you need them for? And then anything that's more advanced gets into internal operational processes, enterprise grade workflow stuff that then has its own compliance and governance process?
Yes and no. It's evolving as we learn more, right? So our kind of almost like a 3-stage process is like we spoke about. So we have some initial guardrails, and that's things like what data or inputs you can put into your enterprise GPT, but then also how wide of that usage that GPT can be as well. So if you're building something which is in your domain of knowledge and you're within the remits of the data you can use, we're relatively comfortable with that, because we're thinking the idea being as the output comes out, you have enough kind of critical thinking of that domain to question whether it's right or wrong. If you then want to release a GPT to a wider audience, which might not have that expertise or that level of expertise, then we have a kind of initial governance step to review what's the material impact of that could be, particularly around, is it going to impact customers? And then if so, we might then have to bring in some layer of review or scrutiny or extra controls within that GPT. And then thirdly, like you say, if we're going one step further and building something more internal, we've already invested a lot in kind of an AI trust layer. So when we are using an LLM, doing the best we can to kind of capture how it's getting to the output it is, capturing the reasoning it's doing, why it's done certain ranking or whatever in terms of its models, and then evaluating the output as it comes out. So as you go through that funnel, the leveling governance increases as well, as we anticipate the impact of if something went wrong to be greater. And that's working quite well at the moment, we find. While I think about it, Sam, a little bit of a sidetrack is we spent a lot of time getting comfortable understanding where our data went in using some of these models, both in terms of the external tools and just the model via API, because you can upload data and that's stored in a certain location. But when you actually send the question through or the inference of the model, that then goes somewhere else. And like we know, there's not a huge amount of AI capacity in terms of power to run these things out there, as everyone's building data centers wherever they can. So there was a difference between the actual physical locations of each of them. And that was something that took a while for us to get under the hood with OpenAI, who was our partner, to understand that, and then get comfortable to understand what we would allow to go in each of those stages. So you can store a lot more because that's, for us, more acceptable of how it's done. But then when we actually send it to the processing of the AI, we still redact a fair bit out of that.
In terms of the actual sort of data quality models, how your technical understanding of LLMs and AI is developed over the last couple of years, not just yours, but at Shawbrook. What were the biggest constraints there? Obviously, we know that in regulated sectors, you've got governance and compliance and all that stuff, and those can be very big barriers, can be good enablers as well. But in terms of the actual technical foundation of these models, how you choose a model, when you move to a different one, all that stuff, what was the hardest part of making decisions around that?
It's a little bit of a cop-out. In the early days, somewhat of a luxury now, because we were using the Microsoft Azure stack, we were limited to what models they had, okay? So which was basically the OpenAI models. As we moved on there, particularly when we looked at the external tools and we kind of went to the key, players in that market, OpenAI, Anthropic, and looked at what they did, it wasn't an easy decision. Ultimately, why we chose OpenAI was because we felt their enterprise offering at the time was just a bit more developed for the financial service company that we are. And Anthropic were probably a little bit earlier on in their journey. But I think the conclusion we're coming to, Sam, is that you're going to need a hybrid of models. Okay. There's not going to be a one size fits all. I think some of the players out there are trying to build models that are one size fits all, but we're finding that, going forward, we're probably going to have a set of foundational models, which are then kind of bucketed into certain use cases. So a live example is we're still struggling to get any real good quality output around using financial data. Summarize this piece of financial data or do some statistical modeling on this financial data. Once you get to a certain size, maybe the answer isn't an LLM. Maybe it's that old AI, as someone called it the other day to me, machine learning. Maybe we fall back onto that. But that's how we're thinking about it, that, for varying reasons, having a hybrid platform of many models, I think it's going to be beneficial.
Yeah, and obviously part of that risk and governance piece is making sure that you can, if anything goes wrong or if there is a better model, you can switch things out so that you're not tied into one platform either.
I know colleagues will take a prompt that they built, say in ChatGPT, and then take it to Claude and say, can you kind of scrutinize this prompt and recommend any enhancements to it? So that idea of one model reviewing another model, I think will grow traction.
You once referred to AI as the shiny new intern of finance. Like you say, you've had trouble getting it to do complex financial analysis. We've had that problem as well with sort of, if you have any ideas, if you come up with any solutions, then I'd be interested to hear about them, because like you say, once you reach a certain scale, it starts to not really be able to keep track of what's going on. So there are other avenues, getting it to do old school things, but like SQL queries, we've tried getting it to come up with SQL queries, and then we just run the SQL queries in a workflow, like say machine learning. All of that stuff, when it gets, when you're the individual talking to it, you can see when it's making mistakes. But when it gets scaled out to predictive analytics and things that a human cannot possibly check, how do you stop it going rogue, this new intern?
Yeah. There's a couple of reasons why I called it the shiny new intern. One, because like we know, it's very good at doing those simpler tasks like just explained, Sam. The reality is it's really good at reading and writing. Who knew that was such an in-demand skill, right? But the other side is it's super kind of ambitious too, that you would expect from an intern. It will never say it can't do anything, and it will never not try and answer a question, which I think is a little bit of a downfall around, to answer your question, is that it's built to appease us. So if it can't do something, it'll still have a go at it. And that's when you start seeing the problems around hallucinations and coming very wrong. And that's what we're finding with financial analysis, right? It will come back with an answer, which could be relatively simple mathematics, which is completely wrong. I would prefer it said, I don't know how to do that, Sam. Can you teach me a little bit more? Yeah, and that's still the gap we have. But how we control that, and like you say, how you offload that is going to be the continuing challenge. And I think all you can really do is be super focused about what you're comfortable using it for and what you're not. So for us, it's still in those high volume tasks, but still tasks where accept a degree of inaccuracy, or it's getting rid of things we don't want to do necessarily. Making a no decision quicker is what we talk about a lot. So stuff where we're going to flow it all the way through end to end still has a human involved all the way. But if an AI can make us make a no decision quicker and reduce some of that off our plate, then we can concentrate on the stuff we do want to do. But it's when I speak to a lot of peers, everyone's in this kind of fast follow category. We're all ready to go once someone does something first. Who's going to do a first fully automated AI decisioning model that the regulator's happy with, and then everyone's going to follow suit after it. But I don't know who that first person is going to go.
And the FCA has been very fast at adapting to AI, and continues to run sandbox projects, etc.
Exactly.
And has been a great enabler for it. But like you say, in financial services, the risk is so high. You do want to see it working out there first before you start to tackle things yourselves, especially when it comes to personal data and sensitive data.
Yeah. But the sticking point is that no one can explain how they really work. And I think it'll take a while for people to just get either comfortable and accept that, or someone will work out how they are working.
Yeah. I'm interested about the training process, how you got people internally, because obviously there's, some of us use AI all the time in our personal lives now, but the gap, because it's happened so quickly, this initial adoption, the gap between those people and people who have never used AI is massive. So how do you go about training? And I guess there are those trust issues as well when you come to the one-to-one usage, because people who have just never been able to trust it to even try and use it, you've got to get over that. Okay, well, how do I rely on an answer, and how do I assess whether I can rely on an answer, because it's not always right?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things to this. So completely relatable. And the biggest problem we had is there's an expectation that AI is going to be amazing. So a lot of people will ask a question, they won't get exactly the answer they want, and then they'll close it and say AI is rubbish. So that was the initial part of our training, was really like you do when you work with a colleague in person. You've got to iterate through things. The more information you get it, the better it is. Don't give up on the first question you ask. Yeah, if it's not quite right, tell it, and then iterate through it, and you'll find it doesn't take many more questions on the same subject, right? 2, 3, it starts jumping from being pretty useless to being pretty helpful, right? So the second trick I always use for all types of people, those who are kind of for or against it, is, where do you start with this stuff, right? It's kind of, to a degree, being pushed on all of us. We should be using AI, right? I hear it's fantastic. So a really simple, good trick that I find worked well is just ask it, right? So we say, go in there. So I'm Sam. I'm head of BI at strategy at Shawbrook, or whatever, a mid-sized bank in financial services company in the UK. How can you help me? And you'll be pretty surprised at how accurate it is and useful about coming back with maybe 4 or 5 bullet points of how it could recommend. For those who are struggling to get, just go away and try that, and then follow that discussion on. And we've had a pretty good success rate of getting by in that way. But like you say, that I think there's always going to be people who are for or against it. I think the key thing is getting them comfortable within their own domain. Yeah. And that isn't for everyone. There'll be some jobs that might not need it, but we're kind of thinking internally now as what kind of skills we need to develop with AI, which is a whole other topic that I love talking about. The future workforce. We both got young kids, and what are they going to do when they hit the workforce? But a key skill we're thinking about rolling out is critical thinking around that. How can you challenge things like the output of an AI to make sure A, it is correct, but B, it's the best answer, should we say, that we should go with.
Yeah. When I ask people, what do you see as the biggest opportunities in the next couple of years for AI, in the next 5 to 10 years for AI, I always get and it might be well justified, the enterprise side, the dealing with customers at scale, all of this stuff. But in talking to you, do you see over the next, at least the next sort of 1 to 2 years, the real opportunity being that individuals in the organization are using it much more and more to complete and to progress in their everyday tasks?
This is my personal view, but you read a lot that AI is going to replace roles, reduce workforce, etc. Yes and no. I think it depends on what type of role you're going to do. If you can, let's say, make your front office salespeople 5 times more productive, chances are in the capitalist markets that we all kind of live in is you're not going to reduce your sales force by 50%. You're probably going to want to do twice as many sales. So I think just the structure of organizations will change from this kind of pyramid where you have a relatively small, let's say, frontline piece and then a wider middle office, back office piece behind it. I think we're probably evolving to a bit more of a kind of square organization that, that those supporting tasks behind your front office don't need as many people anymore, or they're kind of streamlined with the use of AI. But yeah, I agree. For me personally, it's all about augmenting people in their current roles. So we use the phrase automate the mundane to empower the brain. Yeah. So, if you can take away the kind of time absorbing parts of your role, which we all have, admin, paper creation, whatever, and free up our time to do the kind of real value add stuff, then, you'd hope you're going to progress both personally, but also as an enterprise as well.
What's interesting about that, turning that pyramid into a square, is you're already kind of seeing that, that's the necessary part of running an organization, right? But you're already seeing brands and businesses going, well, no, actually, that makes us much more flexible in terms of where we can put people. So maybe as a business, we do want a massive customer service function, and we want that to be people-led. Maybe we do want a massive executive sales function, and we want that to be people-led. It gives you much more flexibility in business strategy in the way that you run your organization as to, how many people you have where. It's quite an interesting thing to think about.
I agree. I think the customer service one is such an interesting one because that's what I see a lot of, right, as terms of impact. But for me personally, when I go online and get a chatbot, the first thing I try and do is get the chatbot to get me to a human. Yeah. So I can see that kind of going full circle, that it could be a potential differentiator if you have a, sensibly sized human-based customer service report that people can actually talk to a human. Yeah.
Although increasingly you will get the very simple question, even offloading the very, very simple questions that customers commonly have, which is what we know is 80-90% of what customer service deal with, and getting an instant response from a chatbot. Okay, all of a sudden you've got your customer service people there, because as soon as I'm noticing much more and more, as soon as you do go, I'd like to speak to a human, you get a human, because they're not wall to wall slammed with, I forgot my password or whatever the common query is, right? So you actually get through to a person, and when you do, it seems to be better. Not always, but it seems to be improving in that sense.
No, I agree. I think that's a fair comment. And hopefully it continues that way. I think the future is a very interesting space. If we look at things like expenses, there's themes going around at the moment of how AI is being used to fabricate expenses. The latest thing I read was, you get your food delivery and you fabricate a picture that something's wrong with your food, right? And you get a refund. Are we almost going to go full circle and become a more physical world again in certain, are we going to have to start manually reviewing expense receipts? Yeah, I haven't worked out what the future involves for AI and where the best bang for the buck is. It will, I hope it just makes us all more productive and frees up our time to do more challenging value add items in our day-to-day work.
And in the next 5 to 10 years, are you turning to customer communication, frontline resources with AI? Where do you see it having the most impact at Shawbrook in terms of interacting with customers?
I think we will, because like you say, that the use case that we spoke about removing those simple customer service makes complete sense. I think our hope is that, we pride ourselves on running a premium service for our customers. So I think part of it will be making that service as easy as possible and overlaying it like you say, when you need to speak to a human, or maybe you don't even decide, we proactively reach out when you think you need to speak to a human or need some human support, how we do that.
Yeah, it's that kind of better identifying people's needs and tailoring service, and digital feeling more human as well, feeling more personalized.
Exactly. So my thinking is, like you say, if we can free up the time of our sales teams, support teams, servicing teams to be more human with our customers on the things we want to talk about, I think that's the best use of AI.
And similar orgs or similar size orgs to you, what kind of advice would you give them for 2026 in starting with AI if they haven't yet at scale? You know, we've all played with it, but how do we really move further with it this year?
So I think if you haven't started with it yet, get started relatively soon. My advice would be, don't spend too long trying to work out the biggest bang for your buck. Choose something which is sensible, relatable, achievable, and get going. Otherwise, you're just going to find too many opportunities. You'll come up with huge numbers in terms of returns of investment. You'll come up with huge numbers that you have to spend to get there. The traditional advice is choose something, get going, and you'll evolve as you go. Because what you choose today, you'll look back in 6 months' time and realize that, that you're in a whole different world in the AI space now. You just got to get in there.
It's great advice. And I think we'll leave it there.
Great.
Sam, thank you very much for your time today. It was great to have you on. We'll, I'm sure, speak to you soon. But for now, Sam from Shawbrook Bank. Thank you.
Cheers, Sam. Much appreciated.